Hello and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie. We always hear that one should not talk about religion or politics in polite company. Well, that admonition has not stopped today's guest, Dr. Gaddini, from asking serious questions about faith and politics and how one affects the other. Dr. Gaddini is working on a new book about how faith impacts political beliefs among Christian women. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you.
It's great to have you on the program for the second time.
Yes, thank you.
About a year and a half ago, I had the privilege of sitting down with you and talking about your first book.
Yeah.
So maybe if you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you study and about your work and maybe your first book as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'm an associate professor in sociology at University College London in the UK. I'm currently a research fellow at Stanford University for the next 3 years, and the goal for those 3 years is to do a research project on Christian women in politics and write a book. And this is building on my previous work, which is looking at Christian women who are single in the church and the experiences that they have.
Yeah, and that first book had the provocative title, The Struggle to Stay.
Yeah.
Right? And you were looking at, I guess, the struggle that single evangelical women go through in what is a patriarchal kind of church hierarchy and organization. Yeah. What did you find out with that? I mean, you were asking the question why women would, or how women would leave, why they would leave their religion. So what were some of your conclusions from your research?
One notable thing is when women enter their 30s, and there's a cutoff around age 33, 34, and if a woman is still single and attending church and part of church life, they start to really grow disillusioned with the church. That's where they start to experience this sense of, I don't belong here. So many women are married. I'm meant to be married. That's the expectation I feel. And yet it's a double bind because the ratio of men and women to the church is really skewed. There are way more women than men, and women are meant to not look outside the church to find a husband. So they find themselves in this double bind, and they are faced with the question, do I stay in the church community I love, even though I might remain single and feel pretty marginalized, or do I leave and get what I want out elsewhere?
Right, and a lot are leaving.
A lot are leaving. So in the UK, where half of the study was based, we see that single women are the largest group to disaffiliate from Christianity. We don't have specific statistics on that in the US, but if you start looking at trends of who's leaving Christianity or who no longer identifies as Christian, we see that women in the marriageable ages are one of the highest groups leaving as well.
And you're working specifically with evangelical Christianity.
That's correct.
So it might help to, if you could give us a broad definition of what you mean when you use that word evangelical.
So the reason I've chosen evangelicals and evangelical women in particular is because that's the group that has a really large presence in the U.S. So not only in terms of numbers, but in terms of political power, in terms of notoriety, and in terms of cultural influence. So evangelicalism is growing in a lot of parts of the world, especially sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. And a lot of that influence comes down to U.S. evangelicalism. So this is a group, and there are a lot of variations, but this is a group that identifies as Christian and whose main mission is to evangelize or to convert non-believers to the faith. Mm-hmm.
And you said there is pressure among young women to marry within the tradition, yet there are very few opportunities to. So I guess my question would be, given that sort of patriarchal structure, a structure where I'm assuming there are a few leadership positions for women within the evangelical tradition, my question would be, why would they stay, right, instead of why would they leave? Significant numbers don't leave, right? I mean,
right.
Even though there are some disaffiliating, what attractions are there to evangelicalism for women that keep them connected to that tradition?
So a lot of the women I met attend charismatic evangelical churches. So that means they believe in speaking in tongues, which is an alternative prayer language. They believe in a very expressive form of worship. And for them, this form of evangelicalism offers them a sense of a spiritual experience that they can't get elsewhere. Evangelicalism and organized religion in general provides people with community. They feel a sense of belonging. It gives people a sense of identity, connection to others. Those are some of the main draws in larger trends if we see of why people are attracted to religion. and certainly why evangelical women would stay despite obstacles.
So the women who left, okay, did they move on to other religious traditions within the Christian sphere, or did they disaffiliate entirely, or do you not do that kind of follow-up?
So what I
analysis?
can tell you on large-scale survey data, we see that the main sort of tradition that people go to when they tend to disaffiliate from evangelicalism is spirituality, which is a very broad, imprecise term for some form of spiritual engagement that's unclassifiable. And that was certainly true with the women I met. So when they left, they were still very spiritual. They would pray perhaps, or still attend even Bible studies that were not through the church. They were still spiritual, but not in any sort of organized official sense.
Right. Wow. And since studying this for your first book, this kind of large block of women, you have since kind of shifted your research focus, I guess still connected with what you found out among women, because one of the things that I think you discovered was that evangelical women politically tended to be conservative. And I guess in 2016 and 2020, you found that overwhelmingly evangelical, I guess men and women, supported Donald Trump for the presidency. Was that a surprise to you? And is this what kind of initiated your interest in this new study of politics?
So my research in general, or myself in general, I'm really interested in Christian women and Christian women's lives. And politics is one aspect of their lives. I'm interested to know what they care about politically, what issues are important to them, how they're engaged politically. Is it just voting? Do they engage with boycotting, protesting? Do they run for office? So all the different forms that can take, especially within a tradition that has very strict gender roles where women are meant to be the keepers of the household. The Donald Trump question is something that I find people are really interested in. I was interested in. It presents somewhat of a paradox. Donald Trump has been criticized for being pretty anti-woman in a lot of ways. There's been sexual abuse allegations brought against him. He's been convicted of sexual assault. So why would women in particular be attracted to him as a candidate, given that one of his main critiques is that he is bad to women? And that's a question that's been at the heart of this research.
This reminds me a little bit about, I'll bring up a little ancient history here, but in the 1980 presidential election, Ronald Reagan soundly defeated in a landslide election Jimmy Carter, and a lot of his support came from evangelical Christians. And people then were questioning, why would evangelical Christians choose to vote for a divorced Hollywood movie actor from California when the other choice was a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher from Georgia? And that gives us a clue here that there's something really interesting going on between these alliances between political and religious positions. And that's really where you're headed with this, right?
Absolutely.
Before we talk about that in particular, I know you're working with women, and this is kind of a tricky research, right? Your method is largely ethnographic, and I would think, and maybe you want to talk a little bit about what that entails, but do you encounter trust issues? Do you have trouble getting women to open up to you about these issues? Because these tend to be pretty private issues when you talk about religion and political alliance.
So as you mentioned in the introduction, these are the two things you're not supposed to ever bring up at a dinner, and these are the two things I'm looking at in my research. I use a form of research called ethnography. So for viewers that aren't familiar with ethnography, this is an intensive form of qualitative research where I not only do interviews, but I also do participant observation. So I attend events, I go to Bible study groups, I do a lot of hanging out with participants, including walks, coffee shops, dinner, movie nights, you name it. It's living life with the people you're studying and observing them in addition to interviewing them. So it requires a lot of intimacy. You have to build that intimacy and that trust with the participants. I'm always really open with the people that I study. They can ask me any questions. I'll always answer truthfully. And even if my political or religious views are different, at the heart of my research is a true and genuine curiosity that I want to get to the heart of the story. I want to get beyond the headlines or what's written in the New York Times or the broad sweeping statements that paint evangelicals with one sort of brush. I want to get to more, what's your story and what's driving you to believe this or to feel this way? And I hope that genuine curiosity comes across to the people I work with.
Right. You guarantee anonymity, so I guess that helps. And
Yeah.
It just seems like a tricky sort of research. My research is mostly textual and historical, so the idea of trying to do ethnography and to do it well seems very difficult. But you certainly pulled it off well in your first book. And
well, I'll say this as well. So this topic, looking at evangelicals and politics, it's very popular right now within the sociology of religion. It's very trendy. It has been since 2020 for obvious reasons. Yet the overwhelming amount of data that's come out is textual, it's media studies, it's historical, and that's important work. But what I've noticed is there isn't a lot of contemporary, personal, qualitative data, and especially not ethnography. It is hard. It's hard for the researcher. It's hard to build rapport. It can be draining at times. It's time consuming. And yet I think it's vitally needed, because what happens when we just have survey data or social media data is we don't necessarily have explanations in the people's own voice, and that's really important.
That is. So you're going to really be adding a lot to this whole
I
discussion.
hope so.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it and looking forward to the next installment of your publication. So let's talk about this project. I think, at least initially, you talk about it as the politics of religion, and you describe it as a multi-phase, multidisciplinary approach. And I think most recently you've completed or nearing completion of phase one. Okay. So just tell us a little bit about the project itself, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about where you are in the overall scheme of the research.
So I started it in 2016, and this is when I was doing my larger study on evangelical women. I was living in the UK at the time. Brexit had just happened. I was hearing from my research participants their thoughts on Brexit. At the same time, Trump had been nominated for the Republican Party to go up for president. And I thought this is a really important moment to capture the differences between evangelicals in the two countries. I shelved the project for a while, and I came back to it in 2020. And at that point, I did about 50 interviews with men and women across the country who identify as evangelical and were planning to vote for Donald Trump. So that was kind of phase one of the project. It was a very broad strokes. Then I moved into ethnography. So I have two field sites. One is here in North Carolina, and another one is in California. I gathered some ethnographic data, and one of my very talented research assistants did some social media analysis at the same time. That's kind of her bread and butter, and I let her do her thing. Now I'm moving on to the phase where at Stanford I'm working with a historian. So I'm going to bring in some of the history of Christian women in politics to the story at the same time as I gather the contemporary data. I'm also switching gears by just focusing on women now. So the previous phases were looking at men and women, and now I'm changing my focus to just hone in on women and their political experiences.
Well, let's talk about both, all right?
Yeah.
So, but I'm really interested here that, I mean, this is so multi-layered, because you're going to be making I guess you're going to be doing some analysis about differences between evangelicalism in the UK and evangelicalism in the US. And then you have these two field sites, which California and North Carolina. How in the world did you come to settle on those two field sites for your main emphasis here?
So California, I'm looking at a region in the Sacramento area, which has been called the Bible Belt of California.
And I find that in and of itself really interesting. Right?
It is. So it's a large state. There's 40 million people. It's primarily Democrat. Some would say it's the most Democrat state in the country. And yet, because it's such a big state, we also have significant pockets of conservatives. And the Sacramento area is one of those pockets. Because of the proximity to the state capital in Sacramento, a lot of conservatives in the area feel a calling from God and an obligation, a responsibility to be involved in politics. And there are a lot of grassroots movements that are building in the area to influence politics on a statewide level with a view to then influence nationwide. So in California, in North Carolina, we have a different story. So it's technically a swing state. It's not guaranteed Democrat the way California is. And I find from the participants I'm meeting, the views tend to be less extreme. So I don't see as far left or as far right as I see in California. California is extremely polarized right now. I've heard many people on the left and right recently saying that they think a war of some sort or conflict will break out in the next year.
Oh my goodness.
Whether or not that's just hearsay and kind of fear mongering, it's hard to know, but that gives you a sense of kind of how heated things are. I really like the comparison between East Coast, West Coast, Democrat state, swing state, and also a state where conservatives are in the minority, California, versus a place where they don't feel as under attack. I think that's going to give some really interesting results.
So conservatives in California, both from a religious and a political perspective, feel besieged right now.
Absolutely.
In this point in history?
Absolutely.
And you think that's responsible for this kind of really rightward push?
Yeah, and I think they feel in the state of California that and I'm actually seeing this in other Democratic states such as Washington and Colorado, they feel so minoritized, so under attack, that they have a lot of anger and a lot of energy to push back, and from a position that I would say used to be considered fringe and is now more centralized.
I have some graphics here that came from your study, I think, some infographics. Maybe we can take a look at them on the screen here, and it would be a good way to talk about some of these. I assume these are initial findings from the first stage of your research, and I'll let you comment on this, but the very first thing is this, the divided country, and you've got red states and blue states up there.
So this is from my phase of research that started with the interviews all over the country. And one striking thing I found is that no matter where they were on the political spectrum, evangelicals felt that the biggest issue facing the country, so that's one of my questions, is how divided the country was. So the division and sort of the vitriol coming from both sides was heartbreaking to people no matter where they were. And I thought that was an interesting commonality, because I also hear that on the left, that this division is something that is plaguing our country. People don't know have different views on how to solve that, but that's a commonality that I don't think gets a lot of attention.
Right, and then you also have here in this second frame that because of some of this division and because of some of this polarization, that many pastors, I guess, within the evangelical community are feeling under pressure. And I got the feeling that maybe ministers are slightly more progressive than their congregations. Am I reading too much into that?
No, I think that's correct. And actually, again, the survey data, large-scale survey data in the country shows that as well.
Okay. So is that going to do you think that'll have some future implications for ministry and the way ministers are educated and trained? Yeah.
So I have some colleagues over at Duke that are looking at training for ministers and how that's changing over the years, and they're doing a really fascinating study. They're also finding that ministers are dropping out of training programs, seminary, deciding to leave the pastorate. They don't want to deal with the pressure and the critiques they get on a daily basis. It's become too much for a lot of pastors.
Really?
Across denominations.
Yeah. And then, of course, from what I've been reading, not so much in the evangelical world, but Christianity in general in the U.S. is on the decline in terms of membership. So I guess that adds another layer of stress about maintaining vibrant church communities and so forth.
Or wanting to grow your community, but knowing. So I'll give you an example. One of the churches I used to study in California, I started with them in 2016. They were very political. They were one of those churches that felt, because we're close to the Capitol, we need to be engaged in politics. Every time I would attend, the pastor or even a guest pastor would mention politics. They would pray for specific bills to get shot down. I mean, this was a very much breaching the politics and religion divide.
Right.
When I went back in 2022 to do research at this church, the pastor didn't say a thing about politics. And I thought, okay, maybe it's a once-off. So I started attending every week, part of my ethnography. Never did it come up. So I spoke to someone who was a long-time attendee of this church and had been in some leadership roles, and I said, I don't know if this is my imagination, but the culture seems to have really changed here. And she said, oh yeah, that's because we're trying to grow the church. We're trying to fundraise for a new church building, and the pastor knows if he's bringing up politics, it could cause division, it could lose members, so he has completely changed his stance Politics is no longer entered into the services.
That's really interesting. Same pastor, just a real
Same
shift.
pastor.
Yeah.
Culture's very changed. The sermons are very different. Even when big, sort of lightning rod, divisive issues were hitting the U.S., such as the killing of George Floyd, the BLM protests, COVID regulations, not a word from the pulpit.
Wow.
So
Well,
that pressure is real.
Yeah, and it kind of feeds into this third panel here, and this is, again, what I mentioned earlier, the idea that there's been overwhelming evangelical support for Donald Trump's presidencies or his presidential runs. And one of the things that stood out to me, and I'd like for you to comment on this, that many evangelicals, even if they don't like Donald Trump, vote for him because he furthers Christian values. Can
Right.
you comment on what Christian values they're finding in the agenda of Donald Trump that would be worth voting for?
I would say that certain policies and issues of his has been coded as Christian values.
Okay.
So whether or not they're core Christian values is very up for debate and open to interpretation. So this would be voters who view abortion, opposing abortion as being a Christian value, restricting immigration, protecting gun laws, and restricting some of the educational pursuits, such as anything to do with LGBTQ+ or critical race theory in schools.
So they see these movements toward greater acceptance for CRT and LGBTQ issues to be against their own kind of moral grounding in the Christian community.
Against, not moral, against their Christian values. They would view that as being against the Bible.
Okay.
And crucially, people that I would interview that would have these views would say this isn't an interpretation, this isn't a moral value, this isn't even a political value, this is a Christian value.
Because it's grounded in the Bible. And
their
evangelicals
interpretation.
tend to interpret the Bible as infallible and
Yeah.
inspired. Okay.
So, but that raises an interesting difficulty for me as a researcher of what is political and what is Christian. The definition varies largely.
Right.
So I'll give you another example. I was at a church here in North Carolina. This was in 2022. The pastor mentioned abortion from the pulpit, against abortion, also mentioned against trans issues. Afterwards, I said to some of the congregants, does your pastor always mention politics from the pulpit? And they said, he didn't. And I said, well, he mentioned these two issues, and I brought them up. And they said, oh, I didn't even realize that. Those aren't political. Those are biblical values.
How about that? Yeah,
So you can, this is my point about the surveys. You can't just ask on a survey, does your pastor mention politics from the pulpit? Someone may respond no, because that's their coding of the word political.
wow, that's very interesting. Let's look at the next group of graphics here, and let's see. You mentioned abortion as a top issue, and immigration as well. And also how different, you hit all these, right? How evangelicals tend to equate religion and politics in many ways. So what about activism? I noticed here I was a little interested in this idea of youth activism being a major channel here for politics.
There have been some concerted efforts by Republicans over the last 5 years to engage young audiences, I'm talking college age, to recruit them to politics, to have them be politically active, and to have them be the new face of the Republican Party. And they've been very successful, I have to say. And a huge part of that is leveraging social media.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah. Well, let's look at the final group of graphics here. One that we talked about earlier was this heavy emphasis on the protection of children and using this as a way of kind of advancing some evangelical positions. So maybe you could comment a little bit on that.
On how religion is used to advance?
Yes, or how the position of protecting children is used to advance certain religious and political positions.
This discourse has a long history in the U.S., so we can trace it back to the 70s. Republicans using slogans such as Save the Children, Protect the Children were instrumentalized in 60s and 70s. And we see that again coming up in the last 5 years. So this is a confluence of factors, including the mask and vaccination mandates that were imposed across different states in response to COVID-19. Again, as I mentioned, in terms of education on LGBTQ identities and sexualities, and CRT. So all of these issues have invoked the Save the Children slogan and discourse that has been operationalized in this country for a long time.
Okay, that's fascinating, and this is kind of the major components of the first phase of your research.
Correct.
Well, let's in a few minutes we have left. Let's look forward now. So you're wrapping up one phase. Now you're going to shift the focus of your research and really hone in on women's experiences with this intersection of politics and religion. What do you want to say about that? Where are you headed? How are you proceeding? And I don't want to ask you if you expect to find certain things, because that would be, I guess, prejudicing your research. But where are you headed with this research?
So two things come to mind. One is not what I expect to find, but what I want to find.
Okay.
One of the things I'm really curious about is when I was doing research last, I noticed that a lot of women were becoming politically activated by the COVID-19 pandemic, the mask mandates, so on and so forth, and the Black Lives Matter protests. So it's been a few years now since then, and I'm wondering what issues are fueling Christian women's political participation now? Do those issues still have like a long shelf life? Have they switched gears to different issues? Have the women that were previously politically active kind of gone back to what they were doing before and stepped away from politics? Where are we at now? Because those were very time and place issues. The other thing I want to say is how important it is, I think, to look at women, Christian women in politics. So as I mentioned, there have been a slew of articles, newspaper headlines about evangelicals and Donald Trump, evangelicals and politics, but there's no attention to gender differences. And as I wrote in my first book, gender is a core organizing principle in evangelicalism. You can't look at evangelical Christianity and not look at gender, because it operates through every facet of the religion. So why haven't we paid any attention to Christian women's views on politics and their importance in politics? I had someone say to me recently, oh, they're just voting what their husbands and dads are telling them. And to be honest, that's not true. Christian women have minds of their own. They're intelligent, they're savvy in many cases, and they have reasons for believing what they believe, and we need to find out what they are and not just use these patriarchal sexist statements that they don't have brains, they're just doing what their husbands are telling them.
Right.
And I really want this research to open that up.
Yeah, that's really important, I think. And one of the things that I have read about the 2020 election is that Donald's support lost some support from, I think, in particular, suburban women. Do you think that there was that loss of support among evangelical women as well, or is there a breaking here? And maybe this is part of what you'll find out with your research.
I don't think in
up.
2020. I
Okay.
don't think he lost support amongst Christian women. So we know with evangelicals, he went from 82% to 79% in the approval. So it's a very minimal decrease. We know we don't have data on Christian women with 2020, but we know from 2016 that evangelical women were right up there in the 80s. So my guess would be it did not decrease significantly. The bigger question is what's going to happen in 2024,
Right.
starting with the primary. Are Christian evangelical women going to vote for him in the primary? Have they turned their attention elsewhere? That's one of my big questions I want to find out.
You're going to be right in the middle of it with your research.
I know, I'm excited.
It's really timely.
Yeah.
Looking forward, how long will this phase of your project take, and then do you turn to the writing phase after that?
I'm doing little bits of writing as I go,
Okay.
so as to not have too mammoth a task at the end. But I'll conclude with 2024 election. So that's where I'm going to close this book on this research, write my book, and I'll have 3 election cycles to look back on. And hopefully it'll tell a story. I don't know what that story will be, but it's a good chunk of time to explore something.
Yeah. Well, I think giving voice to women's attitudes, women's thoughts and feelings, their political positions, their religious commitments is important work, and I really appreciate what you've already given us in the form of your first book, and looking forward to that second book as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll see you back on the show maybe when it comes out.
Okay, definitely. All right. I'll hold you to
See you in a
that.
few years.
Yeah. Thank you, Katie. And that's it for Religion and Life for this week. I hope you join us again next week on App TV as we continue to explore the intersection of religion and culture in America. Until then, this is your host, Ozzie Ostwald.